Today we are going to move from the polytheisms and henotheisms onto the great monotheisms of the world, starting with Judaism, the first great monotheistic religious tradition. The Jewish religion begins with a series of patriarchs and matriarchs, which begin with Abraham. Abraham does not have specific dates. Although the Jewish religion dates his life from 1800 BCE, religious studies scholars date it closer to 1200 BCE. He is believed to have been born Abram in the land of Ur, but was called by God as an adult. God told Abraham to move to the land that he would provide, that he would have many descendants, and he would be protected by God. Abraham left his home and followed God towards Canaan, which is present-day Palestine or Israel. After many years of wandering, the descendants of Abraham, which included Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, finally made it to Palestine, and the Jewish religion was a temple religion centralized in Jerusalem for a very long time. The first temple there, built by Solomon, was destroyed, and the Jews were exiled to Babylon, and then allowed to return to Jerusalem. The second temple was destroyed in 70 CE, and Jews mostly left Jerusalem because of the persecution by the Roman government there. Jews then moved all over the world, especially around the Mediterranean and to Europe. This is called the diaspora. The diaspora is still going on today, even though the state of Israel has been recreated. Jews today live all over the world. The State of Israel was created in 1948 after World War II and a long process of immigration to Israel by Jews from around the world. The Holocaust is an especially significant event in Judaism. It destroyed about a third of the world's Jewish population at the time and pretty much eradicated traditional Jewish life in Europe. Because of the killings and that most surviving Jews left for either Israel or the U.S. Today, the largest Jewish population is in the United States, and the second largest is in Israel. However, it is still one of the smallest world religions that has had a huge impact on the world. According to Jewish tradition, which is found in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, which we'll talk more about later, God created the earth in 7 days. In the first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, God is described as really more of a spirit that hovers over the chaotic waters and creates the world in a very orderly progression throughout 6 days, culminating with the creation of humans on the 6th day, and then on the 7th day God rests. Then there is the story of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, which are the two first human beings created by God. There are actually 2 creation stories in the book of Genesis. The first one, which is Genesis 1:1 to 2:4, is from the priestly source and is thought to be a later addition to the Hebrew Bible, and Genesis 2:4 to 24 is thought to be from the Yahweh source, which is an earlier source. This is also your primary source reading for this unit, which is the Genesis and Adam and Eve story, so I encourage you to read that, as well as the explanation of the different sources that are believed to have made up this story. There are also other important myths of origins that happen in the Hebrew Bible, which is the Genesis creation myth. These stories include stories like Noah and the Ark, the Tower of Babel, Cain and Abel, which are all thought to be part of the primeval history, which is the history in Genesis that predates Abraham, who is the first person that we have a historical record of, which starts a very different narrative in the Hebrew Bible, which is the story of the covenant. Many scholars have tried to understand the relationship between the primeval history, the part of Genesis that predates Abraham, and the history of the Hebrew Bible in general. Because we have a cosmic history that is not localized in these early chapters, and then a particular history of one people, starting with Abraham. So there's 2 very different narratives going on in the book of Genesis, if you're familiar with it. The first 12 chapters are this primeval history or cosmic history that deals with the history of the world and the creation of the world. And then we have an abrupt switch in Genesis 12 to the story of Abraham, which starts the story of the Jewish faith in particular. Abraham is considered the first patriarch of Judaism. He's born in Ur, which is present-day Iraq, and is called by God to change his name to Abraham, leave his homeland and family, and follow God to the land that he will show him. He enters into a covenant with Abraham, telling him that if he obeys God and trusts him, then he will have many descendants, protection, and a land of his own. So Abraham leaves Ur with his wife Sarah and follows God's directions. His son is Isaac. Isaac's son is Jacob, who is later renamed Israel, and that's where we get the word Israel. God renews the covenant with each of these patriarchs as time goes on. Judaism is a religion with many important stages in its history that are remembered and celebrated on a regular basis. It is a religion that takes its historical heritage very seriously and works very hard to remember and commemorate important historical events that have taken on a mythic importance. These historical events are considered mythic or sacred in Judaism because Jews believe that God has a continued hand in history. God shapes the history of the world, so each event is religiously important because it was in some way brought about by God. The first important event that we have is the Exodus from Egypt. This is a mythic event and one that is of great importance to Jews. During this time, Hebrews were slaves in Egypt and were mistreated by the Pharaoh. Through Moses, who is a political leader of the Jews, God sends 10 plagues to the Egyptians in order to convince the Pharaoh to let the Hebrew people go. The final plague is to kill the firstborn sons of all the Egyptians. God tells the Hebrews to spread sheep's blood over their doors so that the angel of God will pass over their houses and not kill anyone that's inside. This event has taken on metaphorical importance as Jews have continued to suffer persecution, and this event is what is remembered in the Passover holiday today. Then, entering the land of Israel for the first time and setting up their own kingdom is also an important event, although it was short-lived as the country was split into two kingdoms, Judah and Israel was defeated in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. When this occurred, the Babylonians destroyed the temple. This is the first temple that Solomon built, and took the Jewish aristocracy captive and took them back to Babylon. This period of time is called the Babylonian exile and lasted until 532 BCE. This was a particularly difficult time for Jews as they were separated from their temple, so they had to start to redefine what their religion was. They could not perform the rituals and sacrifices at the temple that was really a central part of their religion, so they focused instead on writing down and compiling their sacred stories and teachings, so the text started to become the center of their religion and not the temple. They were allowed to return to Jerusalem, however, and built a second temple in 515 BCE, which starts a period of time in Jewish history known as the Second Temple period. Although they were a minority now in Jerusalem and they did not have any political power, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, and most Jews left Israel after that because of the harsh persecution by the Romans. They mostly migrated to the Mediterranean region and Europe. Again, with the diaspora, Jews had to redefine their religion as one without a temple, and the focus became the Torah, which is the sacred text of Judaism, and following the law from Jerusalem. So Judaism has a few important historical stages in its life. Before Jews enter the land of Israel and set up their own government and temple there, they are wandering nomads. They are traveling around through different countries in the Middle East, and they are not in any sort of political power. So that's the first stage in Jewish history. The second stage is when Judaism is a temple-based religion, and this is during the time of the First and Second Temple. And the center of Jewish holy life and religious life, it really takes place in the temple. But after the destruction of the Second Temple, there's never been another centralized temple for Judaism. So that starts what is known as Rabbinic Judaism or Torah-based Judaism, where the center of the Jewish faith becomes the sacred text instead of the temple. Jews were continually persecuted in Europe and North Africa once they moved there, and many fled to South America and North America to escape this persecution. The persecution of Jews in Europe, which had existed since the beginning of Christianity, came to its worst point during the Holocaust. The Holocaust is one of the most significant events in Judaism because it destroyed nearly a third of the world's Jewish population at the time. And since Jews believe that God has a hand in history, they had to try to understand why God let this happen. This was a very strong challenge to Jewish faith around the world, and it completely changed European Jewish life because it mostly eradicated it. Today, there are very few traditional or Orthodox Jews left still living in Europe. Most left for North America or Israel. The creation of the State of Israel is, of course, an event of immense importance to Judaism because it has been prayed for and hoped for since the destruction of the Second Temple nearly 2,000 years ago. It began as a movement called Zionism during the 1800s that called for Jews to move back to Israel and buy land to set up farms and communities there. This migration continued for almost 100 years before World War I. After World War I, England gained control of Palestine after the Ottoman Empire fell. England opened up Palestine to more Jewish immigration and said that they supported a Jewish state. After World War II, in 1948, the land of Israel and Palestine was given to NATO, who supported the creation of a Jewish and Arab state in this land. The Jewish state became Israel, and the Arab state of Palestine is yet to be realized. So we still don't have an official state of Palestine. The Hebrew Bible itself does not explicitly mention any sort of afterlife for Jewish people. In the Torah, the closest thing to immortality that is discussed is what is referred to as sleeping with your ancestors, meaning that the best one can hope for is to live a happy life, have lots of children, and live on through your descendants. Then when you die, you will be reunited with your ancestors. So this is one of the few mentions of some sort of afterlife, but it's very vague and left open to interpretation. In the book of Daniel, which is a later book in the Hebrew Bible, there is the first mention of some sort of afterlife, which is called Sheol. Sheol is not a very clearly defined place in Jewish theology. There's very little said about it, but it is basically understood as some sort of world of the dead or a place where people simply go once they die. Something similar to Hades in Greek mythology. It's not considered a punishment or reward, simply a place that you go after death. Around the time of Jesus, however, which is in our calendar around the year 0, a few hundred years before and after this time, the idea of a Messiah became very popular in Judaism. And indeed, the person of Jesus was very much in line with this thought. Because of the intense persecution of Jews at this time, a hope arose among Jews that a Messiah would come to set things right and rescue them. Originally, the Hebrew term Misha for Messiah just meant a king and was a term used for previous Hebrew kings like David or Solomon. But it evolved into this idea of a king-type person who would become a military leader and conquer Israel's enemies. In medieval theology, there then came to be an idea known as the world to come in medieval Jewish theology. This was first written down by Maimonides, who is a famous Jewish philosopher, and is generally accepted as true throughout the Jewish faith. But again, there is no clear definition of what this world to come is or how one gets to be a part of it. However, Jewish theologians have generally said that non-Jews can share in this world to come even without becoming Jews, as long as they believe in one God and are good people. Judaism is a strictly monotheistic religion. It strongly believes that there is only one God who is the creator of the world and the God of everyone in the world. However, Jews believe that they play a special role in that creation, and that they are in fact God's chosen people, because God personally made a covenant with Abraham and ultimately with all the Hebrew people to provide them protection, descendants, and a promised land in exchange for their observance of the Torah law. Jews see themselves as a priestly people in terms of being an example of righteousness and justice for the rest of the world, and as a way of showing the world the one true God. This does not mean, however, that non-Jews need to convert to Judaism to enjoy the world to come. Non-Jews, or Gentiles, merely have to be good people, believe in God, and live good ethical lives. They do not have to live up to the laws of the Torah like the Jews do. This is why Judaism actually discourages conversion, because converting to Judaism means you are then held to the higher standard of the Jewish people. Anyone can, of course, convert to Judaism, but there's not seen as any sort of theological need for someone who was not born Jewish to convert to Judaism. As long as a non-Jew believes that there is only one God, has a relationship with that God, and lives a good ethical life, they don't have to live up to the higher ethical standards that Jews have to follow, which is following the law of the Torah. Judaism has a strong emphasis on practice over faith. Faith in one God is required, of course, but other than this, other matters of faith are largely left up to the individual. There is no complicated theology or doctrine in Judaism, as other matters of faith, smaller interpretations, etc., are not codified nearly to the extent that the law and its interpretation is codified. So again, practice really is emphasized over faith in Judaism. Judaism is seen as a lifestyle that is based on following the law of the Torah. That is where the large majority of scriptural study lies, in understanding the law, following it, and adapting it to ever-changing situations. Israel, which is the name that God gives to Jacob, which is one of Abraham's descendants, means to wrestle with or to struggle with God, and comes to designate the entire Hebrew people, hence the land of Israel. This definition really is a good definition of Jewish theology as well, to wrestle or struggle with God. The belief in God is foundational in Judaism, but after that, multiple interpretations of smaller issues of faith are hotly debated in Judaism, and this argumentation is really encouraged. This is very different from other religious traditions where doctrinal interpretations are very important, and there's really sort of one standard type of interpretation, especially for sacred texts. In Judaism, the Torah is sacred, that it comes from God cannot be questioned, but what exactly it means, what exactly God is saying, is something that is continuously reinterpreted and debated and argued about, and this is a very important part of Jewish life. For cosmology, in terms of where to find truth, there are two main locations in Judaism. One is the Torah, or the Hebrew Bible, which is the same text, it's just two different words for it. You can either call it the Torah or the Hebrew Bible. And the other is God, who is still believed to be active in human history, and makes his will known through interceding in human events. The Hebrew Bible consists of three main parts: the Torah, the Nebim, and the Ketubim. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is also called the Pentateuch, and this is where the law is contained. This can be quite confusing because the word Torah is now, you can see now, is used for many different things. The Torah can simply refer to the entire Hebrew Bible, the entire sacred scripture of Judaism, or it can specifically refer to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, because the word Torah simply means the law. So the first 5 books of the Bible is where the law is expressed. That's where to find it. So sometimes this section of the Hebrew Bible is simply called the Torah. So just to note that the word can mean those two different things. The second part of the Hebrew Bible, the Nebim, is the prophets and contains what are called minor and major prophets. These are several sections of the book in which prophets came and gave prophecy about the Jewish people. And the last section, the Ketubim, simply means writings, and this is a collection of lots of different types of books, including Lamentations, Song of Songs, Psalms, etc. This section is sort of a hodgepodge of different types of poetry, philosophical writings, songs, hymns, etc. Mishnah is also a very important part of Hebrew or Jewish truth, and Mishnah refers to the legal interpretations of the law that was written by Jewish priests following the destruction of the Second Temple, because they had to adapt the laws that were written for a temple-based religion into one for a text or synagogue-based religion. For example, if in Deuteronomy a certain action calls for a ritual sacrifice at the temple, for example, to sacrifice a goat or a sheep or something like that, that has to be reinterpreted, and some other action has to replace the ritual offering because there is no longer any temple to sacrifice at. So all of the legal codes that centered on this temple-based Judaism had to be reinterpreted so that one could still follow this law outside of a temple-based situation. There have been several cycles of Mishnah, and that Mishnah was also interpreted, which is called the Talmud. The Talmud brings together all the various legal interpretations of the law as they should be applied to different situations. As you can see, following the Torah is extremely important to Jews, even when the situation is completely different from the original historical context. So we have the Torah, which is the sacred text or sacred writings of the Jews, Mishnah, which simply means interpretation and is the act and writing down of the interpretation of these laws, and then the Talmud is actually one text that brings together many of the most important interpretations of the Torah. Also, human history can be a source of knowledge for the Jewish people, as God is believed to have been interceding in human history since the beginning of time, such as the stories in the Hebrew Bible when God either protects or punishes the Hebrew people. So there has been a long tradition of analyzing human history in terms of finding out God's will or God's message through those events. And lastly, in terms of soteriology, or how to live according to the truth, for Jews is of course by following the law, first and foremost. This is the most important part of being Jewish, although how that law is interpreted varies by the denomination within Judaism. So although following the law is believed to be very foundational to Jewish life, how that law is interpreted and what it means to follow the law is different in different denominations. So we're going to talk later on about the different denominations of Judaism and how each of them understand what is required to follow Torah law. So how the law is interpreted basically depends on how conservative of a denomination it is, and we'll talk more about that. Faith in God is, of course, also very important, and following the law is seen as a logical consequence of this faith in God. If you believe in God and the covenant, and you are part of this covenant or this God's chosen people, then you will naturally follow the law.